In the late autumn of 2003, a 26-year-old woman named Vivienne Cote stood at the edge of a field that smelled like cold clay and broken promises. She had driven 4 hours north of Montreal in a truck that burned oil and made a sound like a dying accordion, and what she found when she arrived was exactly what the list she had hoped, and nothing like what she had hoped. 40 acres of former pasture land in the Laurentians, the kind of land that brokers describe as having potential because they have run out of honest things to say. The soil was gray and compacted, the kind of earth that does not crumble when you pick it up, but breaks off in cold, hard plates. The fence lines were down in 3 places. The barn at the back of the property leaned to one side with the quiet resignation of a man who has been waiting for something for a very long time. The farmer selling it was a man named Mr. Boslaw, who was 72 and had the kind of face that made you feel he had seen every possible long variety of failure and was no longer troubled by any of them. He had run beef cattle on the land for 30 years and had stopped 5 years before when the prices dropped and his back gave out and his youngest son moved to Vancouver without asking permission. He showed Vivienne around the property in a pair of rubber boots that had been repaired with electrical tape. He did not try to sell her on anything. He pointed at things and named them with the flat affect of a man reading a grocery list. The upper field, the lower field, the drainage ditch, which does not drain, the well, which is fine, the barn, which is not. You're planning to do what with it exactly? He asked, when they had completed the circuit and were standing back near the road. Vivienne told him. She spoke about mushrooms, about inoculating logs and building shade structures, and working with what the land already was rather than trying to change it into something it was not. She explained that the mixed wood forest running along the back third of the property was not a liability, but the most valuable part of what he was selling. When she finished, she spoke for perhaps 4 minutes. When she finished, Mr. Beausoleil looked at her for a long moment. "My son thinks I should ask more for it," he said. "But he also thinks quinoa is a food, so I don't put too much weight on his opinions." He shook her hand and that was that. She drove home with the signed offer on the passenger seat and an emotion she could not quite name sitting in her chest. It was not happiness exactly. It was something more like the feeling of standing at the edge of a diving board. The commitment has been made. The water is below you. You have not yet fallen. Let me tell you something about how the people in Vivienne's life received this news. It was not well. Her mother called her from Quebec City and spoke for 11 minutes without pausing, which is a thing her mother could do. The words savings and recession, and that man you were seeing, the one with the steady job, featured prominently. Her 2 older brothers, both of them sensible men who worked in sensible industries, called a family dinner that felt slightly too much like an intervention. They meant well. That is the thing about people who try to talk you out of your life. They almost always mean well. Her colleague at the Agricultural Extension Office, a man named Mr. Vachon, who had been recommending the same 4 crop rotations to farmers since 1991, sat across from her in the break room and listened to her plan with the expression of a doctor reviewing a patient's self-diagnosis. "Specialty mushrooms," he repeated slowly, as though the words were in a language he had only partially learned. "In Quebec, outdoors, on logs. Sheetack," she said. "Oyster, wine caps. The climate is actually well suited." "The climate," he said, "is 7 months of winter and 5 months of black flies." She smiled at that, because he was not wrong about the black flies. What none of them understood, what she did not quite know how to explain, was that this had not come to her as an impulse or a fantasy. It had come to her the way her grandmother's knowledge had always come to her, slowly, through observation and proximity, and the particular intelligence that grows only in the presence of living things. Her grandmother, Madeleine Cote, had died when Vivienne was 19 and had left behind two things of practical value: a handmade quilt in a pattern nobody else knew how to replicate, and a collection of 43 composition notebooks filled in her neat, deliberate cursive. Madeleine had been what the people in her village called a gardener. But that word was too small for what she actually was. She had grown food in a part of the province where the soil was thin and the growing season was short, and she had done it by paying attention to things that other people found too small to notice: the angle of shadow at noon, the particular moss that grew on the north side of the birch trees, the years when the fiddleheads came up 2 weeks early, and what that meant for the frost schedule. She kept records the way other people keep diaries, not of her feelings, but of the land's behavior. The date of the first killing frost for 40 years, the way the wild garlic spread along the creek bed, which plants returned after a hard winter and which did not, and what the soil looked like in both cases. The land is not an opponent, she had told Vivienne once, when Vivienne was perhaps 12 and helping her stake tomatoes. It is a conversation partner, but it speaks slowly and quietly, and most people are in too much of a hurry to hear it. She pressed a stake into the ground with the efficiency of long practice. The ones who listen, they're the ones who eat well. Those notebooks were Vivienne's education. She had read them through twice in university, and a third time in the years after her grandmother's death, when grief had made her want to hold on to something tangible. By the time she bought the land in the Laurentians, she had read sections of them so many times she could recite them from memory. Not as a sentimental gesture, but because they were useful. Because her grandmother had been, underneath all the poetry of her observations, a rigorous and practical scientist working without a lab. The specific idea for the mushroom operation had come from two sources: a chapter in one of the notebooks on the volunteer fungi that appeared each autumn along the back fence of Madeleine's property, and a research paper Vivienne had read at the extension office about the commercial cultivation of gourmet mushrooms in Ontario. Her grandmother had written about the fungi with the same careful attention she gave everything else. She noted the species, the substrate, the moisture conditions, the timing of fruiting. She had written, in the margin of one entry, in a different pen, and therefore at a different time: "They do not need us to plant them. They only need us to stop disturbing them." That line had stayed with Vivienne. She thought about it when she looked at the gray, compacted fields of the property, at the forest in the back that had been left largely alone while the cattle grazed the open ground. The forest was doing what forests do when nobody interferes. It was making soil, it was creating conditions. It was, in its slow and patient way, succeeding. She was not going to fight the land. She was going to listen to what it was already doing and join that conversation. The first thing she needed was logs. This sounds simple. It is not simple. Shiitake mushrooms fruit from hardwood logs, specifically oak, maple, or ironwood, cut at a specific time of year when the sap is down, allowed to rest for a specific period before inoculation, and then managed for moisture and temperature through multiple growing seasons. The logs in Vivienne's back forest were maple and yellow birch, both suitable, and she had the right to harvest them from her own land. What she did not have was the equipment to do it efficiently, the cash to hire someone with equipment, or the time to waste on doing it the slow way. She sold her car. This is the detail that people always fix on. When she tells this story later, the way they fixed on Marie Fontenot selling her grandfather's truck, because it is the moment when an idea becomes a sacrifice, and a sacrifice becomes a commitment. She sold a 7-year-old Subaru Outback that she had driven for 3 years and loved in the way that people who live alone in cold climates love reliable all-wheel drive vehicles. She took the money and bought a used chainsaw, a small ATV with a winch, a box of dowel spawn inoculated with 3 different mushroom species, and a 6-month subscription to an online growers forum based in Vermont where people argued passionately about humidity levels and fruiting triggers. She spent the first winter alone on the property, working from a rented room in the village 20 minutes down the highway. She would rise before light and drive her borrowed truck to the land and work until the cold became untenable, and then drive back and sit by the propane heater in her room, reading her grandmother's notebooks. She cut and hauled 200 logs from the back forest. She learned things about chainsaw work that she had not known before, including the precise feeling of a chainsaw chain when it begins to bind in a cut, and what you must do immediately when this happens. She learned that an ATV can get stuck in 3 inches of snow if the ground beneath is soft enough, and that getting it unstuck alone is a problem that requires patience and the willingness to lie face down in the snow for periods of time. Her hands blistered and then calloused. Her right shoulder developed a persistent ache that stayed through the following spring. She went through 4 pairs of wool socks between November and February, and she inoculated the logs. 200 maple and birch logs, each one drilled at intervals and seeded with mushroom spawn, the holes sealed with cheese wax against contamination. She stacked them in the forest in a configuration her grandmother would have recognized, because Madeline had written about how the old farmers in the eastern townships had stacked their firewood to allow airflow and discourage moisture pooling, and the principle was the same. The logs went to sleep in the snow. The mycelium began its slow, invisible work. I want to ask you something directly, because this is the moment in the story where I find myself thinking about what it costs to believe something that no one around you believes. Have you ever been certain of a thing that everyone in your life was equally certain was foolish? Not just uncertain about your choice, actually certain it was wrong? Have you sat across from people who know you and love you and watched their faces settle into that particular expression, the one that is too kind to be contempt, but is not quite pity either, and felt the full weight of their collective doubt pressing down on the place inside you where your conviction lives? That is what Vivienne carried through that winter. Not the chainsaw, not the logs. That weight her mother drove up once in January, ostensibly to bring her a casserole, but actually to see the land and assess the situation. She stood in the upper field in her good coat and her city boots and looked at 200 logs stacked in a snow-covered forest and a barn that leaned 15 degrees from vertical. And she said quietly, "Ma belle, there is still time to do something else." Vivienne thanked her for the casserole, which was excellent. Her mother made a tourtière that nobody in the family had ever successfully replicated, and walked her back to her car and stood at the end of the lane and watched her drive away and felt the kind of loneliness that is not about being alone, but about the distance between where you are and where the people who love you can follow. She went back into the forest and kept working. Spring came the way it always does in the Laurentians, late and grudging, with false starts and setbacks, a week of warmth followed by a week of cold that broke your heart if you had made the mistake of getting your hopes up. But it came, and when the snow finally receded from the log yard in the back forest, Vivienne began checking the logs. Nothing. For the first 2 weeks, nothing. The logs looked like logs. There was no sign of the dense white mycelial threads that were supposed to be colonizing the wood beneath the bark. She checked them in the morning before work and after work in the evenings and found nothing each time, and the cold knot that had been living in her stomach since November tightened slightly each day whim. She called the Vermont Growers Forum. She posted photographs. She described her conditions, her substrate, her inoculation date, her spawn source. She waited. The responses were kind but not reassuring. Give it more time. Hard to tell without seeing them. What was your log moisture at inoculation? She did not know the answer to that last question. She had not measured. She had done it by feel, the way her grandmother had done everything, by observation and judgment rather than instrument. She lay awake one night in March and wondered if that had been a mistake. If the whole edifice of her plan, built on her grandmother's notebooks and her own stubborn conviction, had a crack in its foundation that she had not thought to check. She went out the next morning and turned the first log in the stack and found it, a feathering of white, running along the grain of the wood, faint as breath on a cold window, mycelium, her mycelium, growing. She sat down on the cold ground next to the log and looked at it for a long time. The first mushrooms pinned in June, small clusters of shiitake, their caps the color of wet tobacco, pushing through the bark in a way that still seems to her, even now, faintly miraculous. The oyster mushrooms came next, in great pale shelves that appeared overnight and needed to be harvested within days before they opened too wide. The wine caps emerged along the beds she had built at the forest edge, red-brown and substantial, looking like something from an illustration in a storybook. The quantities were modest. There is no other honest way to put it. Her first season's yield would not have impressed anyone looking for a quick success story, but she had understood from her grandmother's notebooks that the first season is a question you ask the land, and that the land's answer is rarely delivered at volume. What mattered more than the yield was what she learned. She learned her site's specific microclimate, which parts of the forest held moisture longest, which cleared earliest in the morning, where the airflow was best for reducing the mold that could ruin a fruiting body before harvest. She learned that her yellow birch logs fruited earlier than the maple, but exhausted faster. She learned that she could trigger a second flush of shiitake by soaking the logs in the cold creek that ran along the property's eastern edge, a method her grandmother had used on nothing more than intuition about how things worked, and which turned out to have a precise physiological explanation involving temperature shock and moisture uptake. She sold what she had at the farmer's market in the village. On Saturday mornings, she drove there in the borrowed truck with 2 folding tables and a hand-lettered sign, and whatever mushrooms she had harvested that week. The first Saturday she sold out in 40 minutes. The second Saturday she sold out in 30. By August, she had a waiting list. A chef in Mont-Tremblant found her. His name was Mr. Ouellet, and he ran a small restaurant that served local ingredients to people who had come from the city to ski and had developed, in their absence from the city, opinions about provenance and flavor. He ate one of her shiitake at the market and asked if she could supply his kitchen through the fall season. She said she could not yet, but that she would be able to within 2 years. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man unaccustomed to being told he would have to wait. "I'll wait," he said. She believed him. Also that she knew that she needed to give him a reason to keep waiting, and that reason was scale. Here is the thing about mushroom cultivation on logs that is both its great advantage and its great demand. A well-managed log will fruit for 4 to 6 years. The mycelium you establish in the first season is a capital investment that pays dividends for years. But growing that capital takes time and consistency, and the willingness to work hard for returns that are not immediate. It is, in this way, like all genuine agricultural wisdom. It rewards patience and punishes impatience, and it cannot be hurried by wanting it to go faster. Vivienne expanded by 40 logs the second year, then 80 the third. She planted additional wine cap beds in the spaces between the log stacks, using spent grain from a microbrewery in the village as substrate, a material that cost her almost nothing, and produced results that startled her. She built simple shade structures from untreated lumber and woven cloth to extend her seasons into the warmer months. She installed a rain gauge and began keeping records of precipitation and fruiting dates and yield by species in a composition notebook with a dark green cover in her own handwriting, using the same careful notation system her grandmother had used. She was keeping the conversation going. In her fourth year, she hired a woman named Ms. Lafleur from the village to help with harvest 2 days a week. In her fifth year, she hired a second person. She was supplying Mr. Ouellet's restaurant and 2 others, as well as a specialty grocery in the city that paid prices that had initially seemed to her like a misprint, her profit per acre. And she thought about this specifically because she had once been told by a man at a bank that the land had no productive value, was difficult to compare to conventional agriculture because the inputs were so different. She had no heavy machinery, no synthetic fertilizers, no pesticides of any kind. Her primary inputs were logs, spawn, labor, and the patience her grandmother had taught her was not a passive virtue but an active and demanding one. She was not rich by any measure that city people use, but she was debt-free, and she was doing exactly what she had planned to do, and her grandmother's notebooks were open on her kitchen table most evenings, and she felt, in a way she found difficult to articulate without sounding like a greeting card, that she was where she was supposed to be. The visit that mattered came in the 5th autumn. She was harvesting oyster mushrooms on a Tuesday morning when she heard a car on her lane and looked up to see a clean silver sedan pulling in beside the barn. The man who got out was Mr. Vachon from the Agricultural Extension Office, wearing his good jacket and the slightly uncomfortable expression of a man who has come to do something. His professional composure makes difficult. He stood at the edge of the log yard and looked at what she had built. The rows of logs in the dappled shade, the wine cap beds, still fruiting in October, which he had told her would be impossible this far north. The small shed she had converted into a sorting and packing room, with its wooden shelves and its smell of earth and the particular clean forest scent of fresh mushrooms. She let him look for a while. She did not say anything. She had learned in 5 years of tending living things to let silences exist without trying to fill them. "I pulled your numbers from the regional report," he said finally, still looking at the logs. "Your revenue per acre is, well," he cleared his throat, "it doesn't look right, is what I thought at first. I actually called the regional office to ask if there'd been a data entry error." He turned to face her then. He was a man who was precise about things, and she could see that what he was about to say was costing him something. "I told you the climate was wrong for this," he said. "I said specialty mushrooms outdoors in Quebec was a category error. I had been in this job for a long time, and I was speaking from what I knew, but what I knew was not the same as what was possible." He paused. "I was wrong, Vivienne. I owe you that." She looked at him for a moment. Outside the open shed door, a chickadee was doing something industrious in the lower branches of a maple. "I had good teachers," she said. "One of them was living, and one of them wasn't, and they both taught me the same thing. The land is not something you impose a plan on. It's something you enter into an agreement with." She picked up a cluster of oyster mushrooms from the sorting shelf and held them out to him. "Take these. There are too many for this week's orders anyway." He took them with both hands, with a carefulness that suggested he understood they were more than mushrooms. "If you ever want to come back," he said, "and speak at one of our grower sessions, I'll come." she said. "I'll bring the notebooks." He nodded and got back into his clean silver car and drove down the lane. And she watched him go with the same feeling she imagined her grandmother had felt in the moments when the land proved, again and again, that it had been telling the truth all along. That was 14 years ago. Vivienne Cote still farms her original 40 acres in the Laurentians, which she has since expanded to 80, every lot purchased with cash, every one of them land that other buyers had passed over. She lives in a house she built in her 7th year, simple and well insulated and positioned to catch the morning light. She has 3 full-time employees now and a waiting list of restaurants that is longer than she intends to ever satisfy completely, because she believes, and her grandmother's notebooks confirm this, that the moment you begin growing for demand rather than for the health of your system is the moment your system begins to fail. On autumn evenings, when the last of the oyster flush has been harvested and the wine caps have gone to sleep for the season, and the log yard is quiet in the long, golden light, she sometimes sits on her back step and opens one of the green composition notebooks she keeps now, the ones that look very much like her grandmother's, and writes down what she observed that day, the date of first frost, which logs are entering their 2nd year of fruiting, and how the yield is changing. Whether the birch is declining faster this season than last, and what she should plant where it leaves space. She is building a record, a conversation with the land, in her own handwriting, for someone she may not yet have met. Somewhere, she thinks, a girl is growing up who will need to know this, who will be told that the ground is wrong for what she wants to do with it, who will stand in a field that nobody else can see any use for, and will need to know that the field is not the problem. That girl will need someone to have paid attention, to have written it down, to have kept the conversation going long enough to hand it forward. And so Vivienne writes,